Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about AI in business. And with me, I have two heavyweights, superstars when it comes to AI. Lila Tretikov, Deputy CTO Microsoft, and Jacomo Corbo, co-founder and chief scientist at QuantumBlack. Welcome, guys. Besides AI, the last few years, we've been very busy with the climate change topic and trying to understand how to best use all the resources we have to address that. Is AI making a difference in climate change, Lila, knowing that you are one of the few experts out there that combine both technology and climate science?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's starting to make a difference because it's really important for us to understand how we're using our resources. And if you're a company, for example, you actually need to understand what's in your supply chain. I mean, how much carbon are you actually using, just to stay with something really simple. But then in more complex way, how much risk are you exposed to because of your supply chain or because of the properties that you own and the buildings that you have, for example. All of that is now, of course, is starting to get affected by AI because AI not only can take into consideration all of those different data points, it now can run predictions and models to help you understand how much risk your company is exposed to, how much carbon is in your supply chain, how can you create redundancies, how you reduce it. So this is the first piece of that, is recording, understanding, reporting. But what's really exciting is what's coming down the pike. You mentioned algorithms for protein folding. The AI algorithms that are now becoming more and more potent have the promise, the potential to help us actually discover some of the chemicals or some of the different ways for us to create materials that could embed carbon or catalysts that will help us sequestrate it. Because we know already today, if we wanted to recapture all the carbon, there's not enough soil on Earth to actually plant enough trees to do that. So we do need to science it. And in order to science it, in order to accelerate deep science, we actually need AI. And we're starting to see that with these basic models for understanding how two proteins attach to each other and how they form basic structures, and down the line, hopefully, for new chemicals, new materials, new catalysts.
Fantastic. But there's another side of AI and climate change, is the impact of AI on climate. Jacomo, it's been a lot of debate lately on the impact of large models, environmental impact. Are there any sustainable approaches that go deep into technology stack rather than just focusing on one layer of it?
I mean, it's a good point. I think and it's something that's attracted a lot of public scrutiny, which is that more and more of the, let's say, state-of-the-art models for a range of different tasks, across NLP on the one hand to vision to and again to even time series modeling are things are moving to larger models, and these larger models, just in virtue of having more hyperparameters, mean that they have larger compute requirements, and so there is a valid concern at the level of the compute cost that this represents and implications for for energy consumption. But I think it's a little bit that focus is I think a little bit misplaced. I mean, anytime that you have one of these like new state-of-the-art architectures, like it was GPT-2, and then after with GPT-3, you have a number of people who are able to basically replicate the performance, but to instantiate that in much smaller models. And that in and of itself is, I think, a really nice result, and not just from the compute perspective in terms of the carbon cost of it, but also in terms of the accessibility and consumability of those models for companies, let's say, that aren't OpenAI.
What about other regulation? How does the world of Microsoft sees this moving ground of regulation around the world?
We actually see regulation as an important component of a healthy ecosystem in general. And we see regulation in privacy, which is very important. And we actually supported regulation in AI, which we started working on years ago, and setting up some criteria for what AI should should do, should look like, and should act like. And because AI is fundamentally, and we were just talking about what's actually happening, these models are getting bigger and bigger, they're getting better and better, of course, but they're getting less and less explainable as a result, because none of us, not even the best AI scientists, can hold the entire model in their heads. That's the power of AI, that is, it can look at, combine, and be trained on so much data that no single one of us can replicate that. What does that mean? That means we don't fully understand it. So how do we interrogate it? How do we understand how it's going to behave? What kind of biases are going to be embedded in the system, especially if this is going to be used in mission-critical applications? What are the failure modes of these? These are the kind of testing requirements that I need to get, and testing harnesses that are going to need to be put into place. And regulation can help that, and can help actually create some harmonization if the legal makers are actually talking to each other. So earlier this year, I was supporting a couple of work streams with OECD, specifically around how to think about AI, how regulators should think about AI, and how they should collaborate so that we don't have one regulation in one country, another in another country, and we have some harmonizations across them, and also some harmonization across the providers. Because some of the things that are happening today with just plain data is that it's so difficult to take your data from one system and put it in another system that it's a blocker for you as a customer, for you as a company.
One more question from me. Lila, you touched briefly on areas where AI can fail. Are there more examples of concrete failures? We're not talking about existential risk that we should be aware, and we've discussed in the panel before us talking about bias, but on top of it, are there any engineering type of problems that are massive risk when it comes to AI, and how should they think about approaching mitigating it?
Well, massive risk that's a question in general for software, right? It's not an AI-specific issue. It's just as our systems become more and more digitized, they are more accessible to security risk, and we see this. Microsoft is the largest security provider in the world, and we see this as that risk grows. And it grows exponentially as more and more of our world becomes digitized. But I think I want to give you a really concrete example of where AI fails, not because AI itself fails, but because sometimes we fail to understand how we, as humans, interact with each other and interact with computers. So you probably all know really great systems called Teams. It allows us to talk to each other online. It translates if you speak across different languages. So I can speak one language, you can speak another language, and we can understand each other. It will summarize, it will transcribe, all these amazing features that will record you. Well, when we build these features, one of the things that we do is we put it through an ethics review. And typically, engineers, they would want to turn the new hot AI feature on immediately. And that's when the design ethicists will come in and they'll say, oh, let us evaluate how people actually interact with each other. So the research team will come in and will say, well, if you turn the recording button on and transcription on automatically, what turns out is that actually people who are already a little bit marginalized, or there's already bias there, so if it's a woman, if it's a person of color, they will actually, there's a chilling effect. They will not speak up. So when you're faced with that, you actually need to think about how to build the product in such a way that people can utilize the features without having the harmful effect. In fact, create a more inclusive environment for them. So we've worked super hard. We've held the feature, in fact, for a little while, until we figured out how not only to mitigate, but to create a more inclusive environment. And those are the areas where, if we are not careful, we can make things much worse for the world that we want to see. So it's very important for us not just to jump on these incredible things, but to really, really understand and design for the world that we actually want to create.
One question I have for both of you is, yes, the panel is how to adopt AI and businesses adopt AI. Have there been examples where either you said in your capacity, no, you shouldn't do AI, or have businesses come to you and said, we want to transform this with AI, and you've said no? So do you have a stance like that? I know you can't give specific examples, but because I build AI, I see AI everywhere, right? But there are instances where you can draw the line and say, no, AI shouldn't be there.
Absolutely. We've done it many times, in fact. And that goes back to the AI principles that we laid forward several years ago now. So I can give you an example. So as you probably know now, you can synthesize voice and you can synthesize appearance of a person. And we absolutely said, no, we will not make that technology available. Because it's obviously you can make deep fakes, you can create a lot of negative effects with that. It's just not something that is worth putting out there in the world, because our harms assessment framework told us no. That's an incredible technology. The AI was breakthrough, and we don't ship it.
I mean, in the context of the work that we do, it'll be more at the level of how these things should be designed. I mean, I think it's rare. I mean, I haven't seen any individual applications where, let's say, whether it's in the public sector on the one hand or private sector company, outright trying to do something which is like looking to do harm, right? Some of you may have seen the science paper just a few months ago, like where Collaboration Pharma was trying to took basically this is software, ML software that's looking to search a space of compounds in order to be able to meet some kind of objective. And what they did was this pointed at the space of nerve agents. And in roughly like 6 to 7 hours, they came up with about 40,000 compounds, many of which were like known nerve agents, including VX. So like there are very few, and all of that is in the context of that paper saying that a lot of the technologies that are looking to do good, right, which can be pointed at problems like discovering new small molecules for rare disease treatments. On the other hand, can be pointed at things that are actively looking to do harm. There are very few examples, I think, of companies that are actively looking to do that, but it's more a question of how to design them well and in ways that meet requirements, will have not lead to unintended consequences in the way that Lila described. And there, I think it's good to, we talk a little bit of AI as a monolith. I think we all recognize here that we're talking about many different techniques and methodologies. And in many cases, when we think about designing, it's not a question of just meeting a problem, but also meeting even certain compliance and risk requirements. So you might very well pick a technique that could come at a small handicap in terms of performance on a relatively simple task, but means that it's intrinsically more explainable. It's easier to be able to understand like the marginal importance of different features, and this is something that is ultimately, perhaps because of the way in which it's going to be consumed by the end user, right? And so it's more a question of what are the right ways in which to design these things, at least in the way that I've seen it.
One of the things that really fascinates me is why it is that we're now besieged with fake news. Why is more and more of the facts which we are consuming, particularly sometimes in LinkedIn, some of your own projects, are wrong? And it would appear to me that there is very little clearly evolving to check facts in the media. It can't be that difficult. Many of them are binary. They're simple things which you could automate. And I wonder how much work is going on to do this, and how much work is being, if you like, distilled by business, where obviously the more erroneous and provocative facts drive advertising revenue.
Excellent question. Who wants to take it? Lila?
So I think this has to do a little bit less with AI and has to do more with social media and how people actually interact with each other and how they interact online. In my past life, I had the privilege of being in charge of a little website, running the organization behind a little website called Wikipedia. And Wikipedia had near zero at the time, near zero AI on it. And yet, the only reason that Wikipedia actually became and then stayed fairly high quality in terms of news factors, it's because it has very clear parameters of how people were validating those news. Very similar thing is actually happening on sites like LinkedIn and on our gaming and all of our publicly facing sites today. There's actually, yes, there's AI application today to verify that the news are actually correct or the information is actually correct, or that the information is, or that the conversations are positive, right? So that we take down materials that are obviously harmful or illegal, right? All of these applications of AI are already in place today. They're not perfect, unfortunately, right? Because there are situations where it's a humorous thing, right? So you have to understand the intent, and AI is not there yet. These tools are not there yet to understand it in that depth of a detail, right? Sometimes it's a joke. Sometimes it's an imaginary thing that people are trying to pass. You don't always know if it's a correct news. And LinkedIn obviously is not a news channel. It's a sharing environment. Now, if we go and point at that news, that's a very different situation. And there, you actually need to go all the way down to what is the primary source? Like, who was there with the camera, and what that footage was actually the real footage? Because now we can even fake that.
I think the question is an excellent one. I think you're right. Like there isn't. It's already a problem, and a problem of like significant scale, and it's a little bit at the level of, these bots that are amplifying certain content. But by and large, a lot of the content is not used with ML, and I think you're right that there could be, let's say, more ML that's thrown at the problem of mitigating the problem. Right, or the severity of the problem. But I think, and this is maybe like where I'll strike a little bit of a pessimistic note, I think the problem, as bad as it is going to get like incredibly worse in the next few years. Because if you think about GPT-3, and like we're now in a world not just at the level of language, but also at the level of video and images that we can synthesize things that have no bearing in reality whatsoever. And so now, in a world where these bots are just generating a lot of the content, what are the ways in which we really tune these platforms? Because I think ultimately it's a question of the design of these social media platforms. And there, I don't, as Lila was saying, I don't know that it's a question of trying to solve the problem strictly with AI and ML. I think it's much more at the level of maybe curtailing the problem, the level of recognizing that, speech on these platforms needs to be regulated, but that you would regulate speech very differently when bots are the sources of that speech versus individuals. Like these, and I think a number of people have made that proposal that it should be really at the level of identifying, validating identity, and that has a host of other issues as well. But I mean, I do hope that we make a whole lot of headway in tackling that problem, because it's going to get a whole lot worse in the next few years, I think.
Thank you. That was brilliant. I can continue for the whole day and tomorrow, but we know we have to leave the stage. Join me with a big round of applause to Lila and Jacomo.